Journalism has always played an important role in society. We rely on newspapers, television, and magazines to stay up to date on current events. When crimes are reported, journalists set out to uncover the truth. While conducting their interviews, they can bring to light information that was overlooked by law enforcement and generate new leads. In some cases, it's their dedication that leads to an arrest. Number 5. In 1960, the paths of Mary Horton and Felix Vail crossed in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Mary, a former homecoming queen, immediately fell in love with Felix just a year later in 1961, and the couple married. Despite Felix being adamantly against the idea of having children, Mary gave birth to a son on their first anniversary. Mary confided to her friends that the marriage was rocky and that she and Felix often didn't see eye to eye. She wanted to keep her family together and remained hopeful, refusing to give up on the man that she loved. Her decision to stay would ultimately cost her her life. On October 28, 1962, the family traveled to a nearby river with their boat to enjoy a day of fishing. Shortly after 7 p.m., Felix claims that Mary fell from the boat when he swerved to try to avoid a tree stump in the water. Despite his best efforts to save her, she drowned. Her body was discovered days later by police and local volunteers. Felix was arrested on suspicion of murder, but the charges were dropped after the coroner ruled Mary's death an accident. He was given a $500 fine for reckless operation of a motorcraft and released. Because Felix never wanted to be a father and his wife was no longer alive to care for their infant, Felix abandoned their 3-month-old son at his parents' house and went on about his life as a free man. Nearly 50 years later, Jerry Mitchell, an award-winning journalist, would get a phone call from a woman named Mary Rose. Rose explained to Mitchell that her daughter, Annette Craver, was married to Felix in 1983 and subsequently vanished without a trace in 1984. She also told the reporter that another woman, Sharon Hensley, was dating Felix when she vanished in 1973. Mitchell immediately began looking into the details of Mary's death and the mysterious disappearances of the 2 women who were involved with him in the years following. He discovered that Bill Vail was 8 years old when he overheard his father confessing to Sharon Hensley that he had killed Mary. Detailing the story of Felix being a possible serial killer, Mitchell wrote a book titled Gone in 2012. After the book was published, witnesses came forward saying that Felix had also confessed to them that he had killed Mary. A man who was on one of the search and rescue boats when Mary's body was found also came forward with photos of her body which clearly depicted a homicide. Felix was taken into custody on May 17, 2016 in Texas and extradited to Louisiana to face charges for second-degree murder. At 77 years old, he was sentenced to life in prison. He was never charged regarding the disappearance of Annette Craver or Sharon Hensley. In 2002, the Spotlight team at the Boston Globe published an article highlighting sexual abuse within the Catholic Church. The following year, this article would receive prizes for exposing the atrocities. A team of journalists focused on a former priest, John Joseph Gagan. Gagan was ordained in 1962 and began his work as an assistant pastor at Blessed Sacrament Parish in Massachusetts. While there, accusations of abuse were brought to the attention of church officials, but they were quickly dismissed. From 1966 to the mid-90s, Gagan had been involved in 6 different parishes, all of which were aware of the allegations of abuse that followed him. In 1984, he'd been placed at St. Julia's Parish despite an auxiliary bishop expressing written concern about Gagan's behavior. The Globe outlined just how far the Catholic Church went to conceal the priest's crimes when it was discovered that instead of notifying authorities, the church sent him to mental institutions to be cured. 84 civil lawsuits had been filed against Gagan, and the details of the lawsuits had been under a court-ordered confidentiality seal that was granted to church lawyers. The Boston Globe motioned the court to make the documents accessible to the public, and although the Catholic Church appealed, the motion was granted. In total, over 130 victims came forward with allegations of abuse against Gagan, many of which were encouraged by the article published by the Globe. Had 8 journalists not taken the initiative to investigate what was happening within the walls of the Catholic Church, Gagan, along with 4 other members of the church, may have never been held responsible for their crimes. Number 3. In 2006, Christine Pelisek, a crime reporter for LA Weekly, began her journey to catch a serial killer. She received a tip from someone at the coroner's office about 38 suspicious deaths within the last 4 years. All of them were women. After some persistence, Christine was able to get a list of victims and she started to look for connections. She discovered that 2 of the women were linked by DNA and ballistics. Detectives believed that 7 more women on the list killed in the 1980s could also be linked. All of the victims were African American, and many of them were addicted to drugs or involved in prostitution. Because police initially thought that the murders were drug-related, the possibility of a serial killer in the area was never reported through media, and the murders continued. The elusive killer took a 14-year break after attacking Washington. Pelisek created public interest in the murders while writing for LA Weekly. This led to the LAPD forming a task force in 2007 to finally catch a serial killer that had essentially been ignored for 20 years. Pelisek published a detailed article about the killer she called the Grim Sleeper in 2008. This article would be the first time the public would hear of a serial killer in their neighborhood. Determined to get answers, Christine interviewed more than 100 people on the streets of LA. In 2009, she came across a woman who had been shot in the chest and brutally attacked by a man in 1988. The woman had pushed her from his vehicle and left her to die, taking a photo of her battered body as a trophy before he sped off. With DNA evidence from 12 of the murders but no match, police resorted to genealogical databases to find a match. They located the suspect's son, which led them to a man named Lonnie David Franklin Jr. On July 7, 2010, an arrest was made. In Franklin's garage, they found over 1,000 photos of women. They also found the murder weapon. Franklin was convicted on 10 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. On March 28, 2020, he was found unresponsive in his cell at the age of 67. Number 2. On November 28, 2018, Julie K. Brown published a series of articles in the Miami Herald. The piece was called Perversion of Justice and detailed how Jeffrey Epstein evaded life in prison when he was faced with a 53-page federal indictment in 2007. With the help of Alexander Acosta, Epstein served a lenient 13-month sentence under a non-prosecution agreement. This agreement allowed Epstein to avoid a thorough FBI investigation that would have surfaced even more victims and allegations. Breaking federal law, Acosta sealed the agreement until it was approved, preventing the victims from contesting it in court. Brown identified 80 women who were abused by Epstein from 2001 to 2006 in Florida and New York. 8 of those women came forward and agreed to be interviewed. The Herald petitioned New York State for sealed documents related to the case and obtained thousands of court and FBI records along with the witness statements. It was discovered that there were over 100 girls alleging abuse against Epstein. Before Perversion of Justice was published, many details were not made public knowledge. This included statements from 4 of his victims who recounted the abuse. Her coverage of the illegal plea deal, as well as these statements, renewed interest in the case. Before long, a large-scale trafficking ring was uncovered. On July 6, 2019, Epstein was arrested and charged with sex trafficking. On August 10th, he was found unresponsive in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York. Although it was ruled a suicide by hanging, there's a lot of controversy surrounding his death, and it's currently still under FBI investigation. Number 1. Mabel Norms Reese was the owner, editor, and reporter for a Florida newspaper called the Mount Dora Topic from the 1940s to the 1960s. When 4 young African-American men were accused of raping a woman in 1949, Reese immediately interviewed the sheriff to cover the story. Believing everything Sheriff Willis McCall was telling her, she wrote her articles for the paper. In 1951, though, her perspective changed when she learned that McCall not only gunned down one of the defendants before the arrest, but shot 2 of the men while transporting them to a new trial. One man died and the other survived and denied the sheriff's claims that the men jumped him. Not one to settle for injustice, Reese began to expose the truth about the sheriff when she learned that he had ties to the KKK. After publishing her articles, Reese was targeted by the group. They bombed her house twice and set a fire on her front lawn. Immediately following the attacks, Reese published a photo of her holding her dog in front of the burning cross, a statement that she would not be silenced. Even after her dog was poisoned 2 days later, she persisted. The remaining 2 men were ultimately sentenced to life in prison. Walter Irvin was released in 1968 and died the following year. Charles Greenlee was paroled in 1962 and lived with his family until he died in 2012. In 2016, Groveland Mayor Tim Lukes, along with the Lake County Commission, issued a public apology to the surviving families of Ernest Thomas and Charles Greenlee, Samuel Shepard, and Walter Irvin. They began lobbying for a pardon. On January 11, 2019, all 4 men were granted a pardon in a unanimous vote by the state of Florida. The courage and relentless reporting of Mabel Norms Reese may not have led to an arrest, but it shed light on the corruption of a racist sheriff and the wrongful conviction of 4 young men. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.